Good afternoon, welcome to EduSet Network. Friend, as you know, we are having discussion of changing world dynamics in India. We have already discussed India relation with Asian countries, American countries, Latin America and European countries. Today we will move further and we will talk about India's relation in context of Africa, and also we will talk about multilateralism and multiculturalism. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Aparajita Kashyap. She teaches political science in Guru Gobind Singh Infrastructure University and have keen interest in international issues. So on behalf, I welcome her for EduSet lecture on this very topic. Welcome, ma'am.
A very good afternoon. Continuing with the series of lecture on the changing world and the position of India in this changing world. We have already covered United States, the entire South Asia. We have covered Latin America and Europe. And today's discussion would be centered around the African continent. Why is Africa important? Why are the changes in Africa? How are they affecting India's relationship, and how is India reinventing its role? And in that aspect, then I would also like just sketchily to deal with multilateralism and multipolar issues, so that when we talk about, we are not talking about bilateral or multilateral relations. We are taking up issues on the basis of continents, but in the end we would take up issues which are beyond continents. They cover a whole spate of continents. So moving on from here, I would just like to begin it by saying that India and Africa, they have had a long shared history, because it is not, the relationship is not new. In the historical times, Indian merchants had an extensive trade along with the eastern coast of the African continent, and this trade was in various aspects, and of course distance is another cementing factor, because the distance between Africa and Asia is not that much, and ships were easily ferrying goods and people across the continent. Now so much was the contact that leading Indian strategist C. Raja Mohan had described Africa as India's near abroad, and this is the closest that we could, because see, let's look at Mauritius and the kind of population that is, the mix of population, the kind of culture, it is almost like an extension of India because of the proximity to the Indian continent. Now let's get back to the era of Gandhi and Nehru, and we can say that apart from history, from in the modern times, if we say Mahatma Gandhi laid the moral foundations for Indo-African relations, but actual political structure or the structure or formatting was done by Jawaharlal Nehru, declaring that Africa, and I quote him, though separated by the Indian Ocean from us, is in a sense our next door neighbor, and that in historical perspective Indian interests are likely to be bound up more and more with the growth of Africa. And that was the kind of vision which Nehru had. Now we know about Gandhi. Gandhi was staying in South Africa, and so he belonged there, and his notion or his view was totally different, and it was actually a first hand view of the happenings in Africa. Now Nehru pursued a policy of supporting African national struggles against colonialism as well as against apartheid in South Africa, and this movement against apartheid was actually a gift of Gandhi, and it was carried on further. Now even when in the 1990s, when African National Congress was moving towards removal of the apartheid system, India was lending its support in one way or the other. Now not only this, forget about the bilateral issues. Now we see that together with China's Zhao Enlai, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, Ghana's Nkrumah, Indonesia's Sukarno and Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh, Nehru played a very major role, and he had convened the first Afro-Asian conference, which brought together representatives from 9 countries, 29 African and Asian countries, and famously called the Bandung Conference. This eventually gave rise to the non-aligned movement. Now it is, if we look at the background of any of these countries, the Asian country, the African country or the Latin American country, there are certain things which are very common, and we have to look into the background of the things before we actually start analyzing the dynamics of the politics. Now, all the countries of Africa, Asia and Latin America that I talked about yesterday experienced varying pace of economic growth and development in face of globalization and growing interdependence. So, globalization was definitely hurting them, and what was hurting more was that they were being used in this process of globalization to extract the most amount of benefit, but the fruits of this benefit were not being accruing to them. So, they were deprived in a way of the fruits of globalization, and this is when these countries, they start resenting globalization. The growing economic multilateralization at the international and local level also manifested itself in setting up of a large number of associations. Some of them were bilateral, some of them were regional, and others were multilateral. And the core focus and the focus of all these organizations was development. Now, African countries, they formulated economic and political package called NEPAD, and there were several regional and sub-regional organizations, trading arrangements, all these were being made by the efforts of the African nations themselves. But because of certain limitations, they wanted to involve people from outside so that it would lend more credence to this movement, and they thought they were not trained enough, so they needed help from outside. And if we look at India at the same time, same point in time, if we look at India, we can definitely say that the Indian economy was slightly better placed related to the African development. So, it was very easy for India to help them in sharing experiences in areas of agriculture or information technology, infrastructure, health, energy, human skills, and also democratic governance. You know, democratic governance was one point where Africa was majorly lacking, and I will come to that later, how like they were also being decolonized, but India behaved as if it was a democracy for a long time, and these countries were nascent democracies and struggling, and that is why we had swing of democratic rule and then again undemocratic rule, because the situations were going out of hand. So, to control all this, then we had the military dictators coming in, and then Indian economy, India could give them lessons in disaster management, in conflict resolution, how to handle refugee and displacement problems, also in terms of poverty alleviation programs and promotion of gender equality. So, all these were the areas which were highlighted in which India had a definite advantage, and it could share its experiences with Africa. Now, one important factor, as we talked about this factor also in the case of Europe, Europe has a huge Indian diaspora, and the moment you have a huge Indian diaspora, then the policy making becomes a little biased towards that diaspora because they are contributing a lot to the society. Similarly, the Indian population in Africa was an important segment of the society, and their skills, economic strength and educational advancement were making large contributions. So, this aspect, that having a large Indian population, helped in promotion and further cementing of Indo-Africa relations. Now, if we look at both the countries, we realize there are 3-4 common things, that both they became natural allies. And what were the reason why they became natural allies? First of all, both fought big wars against imperialism. Second was that both were fighting against the capitalist system. So, the enemy was common, the capitalist system. Then both had the similar view on disarmament. They said that disarmament is very important, and once you have disarmament, then the nuclear proliferation will stop, and these developing countries would then spend less amount of money building their nuclear armaments and would spend this money on development. So, these are the 3-4 factors why India and Africa seem to be natural allies. Now, if we look at Africa, we realize that there are some very important landmarks. That is, for all its clout and weight, India has long shown meager diplomatic clout in Africa. Now, if you see, the New Zealand staffers are more than the Indian staffers, diplomatic staffers in Africa. Now, historically its diplomacy was constrained, okay, historically it was fine that it was constrained by poverty at home. Then we had fraught relations with neighbors, notably Pakistan and China, and we were anxious to avoid taking sides in the Cold War. So, maybe we were apprehensive about having diplomatic relations. But after all this, we have emerged from all this, and then why do we again not become proactive? Now, with the China factor again in Africa became very important. China started building more and more relations and intense relations with more and more countries. So, the problem was that once China becomes interested in Africa, then India gets alarmed, and it says that some area which was its natural ally is passing on to its enemy, and now so India starts trying harder to get noticed that look, India is active and India has a presence in the African continent. Now, if talking further taking on the similarities, if we look at both were ruled by colonial powers for a very long time, and both were exploited and faced discriminations. Both have diverse cultures, places, languages and people. So, diversity of culture, diversity of people exist in both these places. Both are in the southern hemisphere of Earth, and if we say that southern hemisphere in terms of geography and south, both are part of south in terms of economic development. Now it is important to say that both are in the southern hemisphere of the Earth, because both of them face approximately the same environment and the same climatic conditions. So, climatic condition is one of the indicators of power. How if it is a temperate climate, you are a big power. That is one of the important elements of power. Now, both have utilized and underutilized resources which can give them wonderful future. For example, why is Congo the hotbed of interest of most of the imperialist countries? The reason is that Congo, being a rich having a rich source of uranium, is very important, because see, Congo although has the potentiality it has, but the actuality is lacking. That is, it has the reserve called uranium, but it does not have the industrial capacity to transform that uranium into usable nuclear weapons. So, it has the potentiality, but it does not realize this potential, and that is why you see most of the imperial powers have had their interest in Congo, because they want to control uranium. And for example, uranium, if it exists in Canada or Czechoslovakia, they have become big powers because they were backed by the industrial capacity to convert uranium into a useful product. So, this is an important aspect, that we have resources, but we are not utilizing it. If at all we are utilizing it, it is underutilization. And then we have similarities in terms of population, huge population, not very skilled, not very highly skilled population. A lot of labor force exists in both the countries, and the human resource in the Human Resource Development Index is very similar for both these areas, that is India and Africa. Now, if we look, if we talk about relationship is not only based on similarities, there have to be dissimilarities or differences. So, the differences is that compared to India, Africa has been exposed to longer era of colonization. Then it was the most important breeding ground of imperialism. So, this is very important. It was one of the most important breeding grounds of imperialism. Then what India had and what Africa did not have was the visionary leaders. So, lack of visionary leaders. Most of them were too worried about their personal achievements, and of course, I am not mentioning everyone, but exceptions are there, but most of them. For example, let us look at Gaddafi, or let us look up Mugabe. Mugabe, although is not a very negative person. Then the Egyptian president, most of the military dictators that we had, Idi Amin, all of them had more often than not were interested in their personal progression or their personal achievement rather than working for the entire country. and this is why the democracy in Africa were very fragile. They were not deep-rooted democracies, and this led to spate of military dictatorship. See, an important reason or contributor to emergence of undemocratic regimes or military dictatorship is the abundance of natural resources. A, that you have abundance of natural resources, and B, you lack the capacity to utilize those resources. So, these are the perfect breeding grounds for undemocratic regimes. And Africa had umpteen civil conflicts. We talk about any country, we talk about Nigeria, we talk about Sudan. Every country, most of the sub-Saharan African countries, they had a whole number of civil conflicts taking place, and this is where they were different from India, and this is why they started lagging behind. Now, when we are talking about strategies in dealing with Africa, so what were the relationship? How were we dealing with the African nations? Now, there are 4 aspects. According to Professor Pushpesh Pant, he highlights 4 ways or 4 strategies in dealing with Africa. One is when we look at the relationship of India vis-a-vis the Arab states, that is, it changes according to the situation in the Middle East. For example, let us look at Libya. Libya, Colonel Gaddafi was a dictatorial ruler, but we were not taking any stand or not criticizing him outrightly because it would maybe antagonize the Arab world. So, we were keeping mum on Gaddafi's situation. Then Nigeria, we do not say anything. Nigeria, India is definitely, it is keeping quiet, although Nigeria is also strife torn. There is a Biafra region in Nigeria which wanted to secede, but India did not condemn this efforts of Nigeria, because it is a rich oil producing country, and that is why you see the number of Nigerian citizens who are involved in drug trafficking in India, and we still try to just ignore these kind of deep rooted issues, because we do not want to antagonize Nigeria. Then with South Africa, we have had deep historical ties thanks to Gandhi, and we contributed a big way in the anti-apartheid movement. So, one are the Arab states, one are the countries of Middle East, second are the second is Nigeria, third is South Africa, and the rest are all those states with which India has minimal relations. So, you can club them into one, and a very minimal efforts made to have any relationship or any statement or any agreements with those countries. So, now I would like to take specific examples. For example, during the 1960s, the Congo War had escalated into a very large deep rooted conflict, and India did send peacekeeping forces. Now, in Rhodesia, for example, there was a racist government in place, and then this racist government was replaced by African dictator Robert Mugabe. Under Mugabe, Zimbabwe was okay, it's slightly better, but India was always careful. It was sensible enough not to give any statement outright enough. It never criticized the government, but it also ensured at the same time that no economic aid was provided to the Mugabe government. So, it was being very careful. It was treating a careful path by saying that okay, Mugabe, we will not take any stand. And then I talked about Nigeria, that Nigeria, India has tended to, most of the time, the majority of the states in Africa, they were going through difficult nation building stages, and Nigeria was one of them, but with Nigeria, India maintained a totally different stand. Then Uganda, the case of Uganda, Idi Amin was one of the worst dictators in national history, and still we maintained a status quo. We do not outrightly condemn his activities. Then is the case of Tanzania. The leader of Tanzania was referred to as the African Gandhi, and later on he does not behave in the Gandhian fashion, and still see the kind of labeling that we did, and then we do not condemn. So, somewhere down the line we have been apathetic towards issues in many of the African countries. Then if we look at the collaborations that India has had, like forum or institutionalization of the relation or actually concretization of the relationship, then the first and foremost organization that come to our mind is IBSA, the Indo-Brazil South Africa Association, and this is a dialogue forum which was launched in 2004, and there was a lot of social issues, economic issues that this forum was taking up. The goal, but the main goal, look at the timing of the formation, 2004, and the main goal was to achieve a common position at the Doha round of talks, and then also in other multilateral settings then they could act collectively, and these three major southern nations were very important countries. So it was more as a cementing of these three countries so that they could take collective action or have collective voices at the larger forum. Second association which is of importance is the African Union. Now, the African Union is an international organization consisting of 54 African member states. This includes Morocco, but this excludes Morocco, but includes the Sahrawi ADR. This is one faction of Morocco. Now, it was founded in Durban in July 10, 2002, and earlier it was called the Organization of African Unity. The mandate also slightly changed. And interestingly, India is a member of the AU Partners Group, AUPG, which meets periodically in Addis Ababa. So, India is totally, it is kept updated of whatever is happening in African Union meetings, and it can also give its inputs in when it meets at Addis Ababa as part of the partner group. Now, Afro-India Summit, this is also it's a very regular exercise which India and Africa are undertaking. An Afro-India Summit, the second in 3 years, with leaders of 15 African countries, produced a surge of shared goodwill. India is the third biggest contributor of UN peacekeepers to the continent, helping clamp down on civil wars in Sudan and Congo. We still have Indian peacekeepers in Sudan and Congo. Now, Indian Navy chases Somali pirates. Somali pirates are a big nuisance in the Red Sea area, and it is the Indian Navy which is helping in curbing down this kind of piracy. Now, India's record of speaking out against apartheid in South Africa was an honorable one, disregarding the fact that it was a British effort or a white effort. India still did not hesitate to criticize apartheid movement. The India Africa Summit, okay, this is I told you that these are very regular meetings which are being held, where leaders of the African nations, the African Union Commission and India together, they participate, and this has represented a turning point in India African Union relations. Now, this summit adopted the Delhi Declaration and the Africa India Framework for Cooperation, and this has formed the blueprint for cooperation between Africa and India in the 21st century. So, the blueprint for collaboration now in the present age after 2008 is guided by this framework convention for cooperation that has emerged. Not only this, if we look at other ways in which India and Africa are collaborating, or Africa is being assisted by India, has been termed as defense diplomacy. As part of its defense diplomacy, the African military students or cadets, they are brought into India, trained at NDA, trained at IMA, then further post graduation in National Defence College or Defence Service Staff College in Wellington, and many of them are now the military leaders in Africa. So much is the contribution of India towards training the military forces of the African nations, some of the African nations. Now, India is helping, but it is not without reason that India is helping. India has reasons to help, because there are certain mutual benefits which are going to accrue to India out of this alliance. Now, what are the mutual benefits that India is going to gain? So, let us look at it in a structured fashion. First is that the fact is that both of them are cooperating for mutual benefits. Some, of course, this is politics. No country is philanthropic enough that it will just give and not take anything from a relationship. The need of India to help Africa is evident that most of Asian countries around India are very small countries, all right. So, if it is a time of need or emergency, then India is not going to ask these countries, India cannot ask these countries to help. So, second important thing is that these are very small. So, the kind of help that India is going to expect is not that much. Second is that with the collapse of USSR, now the offshoot of USSR and an important offshoot is Russia, but Russia is not in the stage to help as it was once. So, the coming in of help becomes restricted. So, then India has to look elsewhere for help, and where else no place is better than looking into Africa. Now, China and Pakistan are ready to dent the opportunities of India. Now, India is seeking a UNSC permanent membership. Now, if India gets this permanent membership, it is going to be a huge blow for China and Pakistan. So, China and Pakistan are doing all that they can so that India is denied this status. And now, if we are looking at the size of the General Assembly, size of the United Nations, a major component are the African countries. So, if we have friends and allies in these African countries, they are the ones who will stand by us and who will espouse our causes. So, this is one benefit that India is going to gain, that is, its case for asking for a permanent seat may be enhanced. That now we are also, another reason is that we are wanting a South-South cooperation. The world, as we know, is not only divided amongst northern and southern hemisphere by the equator, but there is also economic division, and the north stands for the developed countries and the south stands for the developing countries. So, now we are seeking a South-South cooperation to be more assertive, and the moment we try to assert ourselves, we have to look for partners, and where can we get more partners of the south, that is the developing category, than Africa. So, Africa is the option. And then the other benefit that we are going to gain out of Africa, of course, is the huge amount of resources, the richness of resources that is present in Africa, that is definitely going to help us in our trade and industrialization. Now, India has helped Africa in various issues and is ready to help it as India is emerging as global power, and Africa is also moving towards becoming an emerging power. Now, if India helps Africa and Africa helps India, this is a mutual benefit, and both can, this kind of a relation, because both of them are almost at the same pedestal. So, this kind of a relationship is going to help them in getting benefits out of this relationship, and also that this kind of a relationship is one which can be sustained in the longer run. Now, can we say that this relationship is without future? Does it have a future? Because see, Africa is huge, problems in Africa are endless. India has its own compulsions and preoccupations, and this is why India is always, it becomes proactive at one point of time, becomes complacent at the other point of time. So, the problem is that there is no consistency or sustainability in relationship. So, in order for the relations to be sustainable, we have to be in constant engagement and constant interaction. So, the first future is that the relations between India and Africa have to be sustainable. The second option is that the trade should be increased and India should offer help to Africa wherever it is needed, unconditional help. At times it has to be conditional, because no country is going to do philanthropy, as I said, but at least it should be offering help at certain times, even when there are no benefits coming out of that. Now, it should also work with the African countries, international organizations, because see, even on, as I am going to talk in the future slides, that how environmentalism started seeing that the northern countries were trying to dominate or dictate the countries of the south. So, this is very important, that you have to have a platform where you work together and make your voice heard. Now, India should also take forward platforms like G77 and others as mouthpiece of Africa's organizations or inspirations. If Africa has an aspiration, how can you express that? And the best way to express those kind of aspirations is being part of the larger groups like G77, groups like IBSA or BRICS, and then you try and put forward your aspirations. And the other thing is that both the countries should recognize their strength and utilize it to gain out of their abilities. These are our strengths, these are our weaknesses. Why don't we capitalize on the strengths and we try to minimize the weaknesses? And this is the future of relationship between Africa and India. Now, leaving these kind of two-way engagements where on the one side we had one group and the other side had India. Now, these kind of interaction, and we move on from here to multifaceted engagements where there are not one partner but multiple partners, and there are three issues which come to your mind. One is multilateralism, the second is multipolarity, and the third is multiculturalism. Now, I would be talking in details about the first two, multilateralism and multipolarity, because these are more of political issues. Multiculturalism I would just touch upon and maybe take it up in some other time when it is more of sociology that we are going to talk. Now, I would like to begin my this area of presentation by saying, quoting PM Manmohan Singh in the India Today conclave of 2005, he said, "If there is an idea of India by which India should be defined, it is the idea of an inclusive, open, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual society." I believe that this is the dominant trend of political evolution of all societies in the 21st century. Therefore, we have an obligation to history and mankind to show that pluralism works. India must show that democracy can deliver development and empower the marginalized. Liberal democracy is the natural order of political organization in today's world. All alternate systems, authoritarian and majoritarian in varying degrees, are an aberration. So, he says that if you have to catch on or capitalize on the multiple identity of India, multiple identity meaning multiple culture, multiple ethnicity, multiple language, then the only way out is to have democracy, and then you have multiple forum where you can represent these kind of ideas, and not having majoritarian or dictatorial or authoritarian regimes, because these will not let multiple identities exist. So, from this then we go on to see what is multilateralism. Now, if we look at multilateralism, we realize that it is a free and fair multilateral trading system which serves the best interest of any liberalizing economy. So, the most important condition is that it has to be free and fair, and the economy that is existing has to be a liberalizing economy, because in a closed economy there is no scope for multilateralism, because investment or interference is all dominated by the state. So, if we look at the world, there are three things which are emerging. One is that there has been a huge proliferation of bilateral agreements, regional free trade agreements, and the primacy of the multilateral trading system has emerged. That is, rather than bilateral tradings, multilateral tradings are more important. So, this is authenticating the fact that we need more poles of power. Then, according to Jagdish Bhagwati, he is the internationally renowned trade economist. He wrote his book, very interesting, Termites in the Trading System. This book documents how preferential trade agreements have undermined the prospects for multilateral freeing of trade, serving as stumbling blocks rather than facilitators. So, he says that the moment you have preferential trade agreements, you are bringing obstacles in the way. So, this is very important. So, multilateralism and then counter it with free trade agreements. So, both will not go hand in hand. Now, numbering by now over 300 and rapidly increasing, these preferential trade agreements may take the form of free trade agreements. These are preferential first and then they become free trade agreements. They have recreated the unhappy situations of the 1930 economic crisis, the major economic crisis, when world trade was dominated by indiscriminatory practices. So, he goes on to say that if we have FTAs in place of PTAs, and we are going to recreate the economic crisis that existed in the 1930s. Now, let us leave the 1930s, and because India is our concern, India is the aspect with which we are looking at the world, then we are moving straight on to the 1990s. Now, during the 90s, India was going through a major transformation. There was economic liberalization, and the Indian government realized that state controls on economic activity and inward orientation growth has to be removed. So, you have to have a liberalized economic activity regime, and the growth process or the production process has to be outward looking. Now, India was never a completely planned economy. So, the collapse of USSR, which was the leading example of world's centrally planned economy, provided India to give, it gave reasons to India to give primacy to market over planning. So, they said, look, this is a country who was too deep rooted into centralized planning, and this country has failed. So, why should we carry on with a centralized planning? Let market take over the planning, and this is when the idea of liberalization is coming into the Indian context. Now, the immediate impetus to reform restrictive domestic investment and international trade policies came from the severity of the economic crisis over the world in 1991. 1991, world was going through a major crisis. Now, the sustainability of economic reforms that the India initiated during the 1990s, starting 1991, resulted mainly from two factors. First was that the country's cautious and limited deregulation in the 1980s delivered rapid growth. So, they had started experimenting with liberalization way back in the 80s, and this was showing fruits. So, this gave them a little bit of encouragement. The second was that India's engagement with the multilateral trade arrangements helped it to sustain the trade liberalization process that started in 1991. So, beginning of the 1990s, we have a multilateral trading agreement, and that is also enhancing our trade. So, India realizes that economic reforms are possible and desirable. So, India brings in a major economic reform. What happens 1990s and after? Although this growth that we had after the coming in of the economic liberalization, it made further liberalization of the policy regime politically acceptable. Now, even the politicians were happy about, because they had an example which has been set. So, they were happy to have changes or reforms in the economic system, and this became politically acceptable. This I quote Srinivasan and Tendulkar in 2003. Now, after involvement, active involvement in the World Trade Organization agreement, it helped India bring about certain policy changes. There were major changes in agricultural sector, in textile sector, and I would like to quote the agricultural sector's change. While the agricultural sector is still reasonably protected with high tariffs, the phasing out of quantitative restrictions, that is called, these are called the QRs, has arguably been the single most successful area of trade liberalization, and this is mainly happening because of India's commitment to WTO or GATT. So, the agricultural sector is gaining majorly from India's liberalizing tendencies. There were other economic efforts which were also being made. The unilateral reforms initiated in the early 1990s and India's WTO triggered policy changes, they had a major impact on the exports, and because we had higher exports, it resulted in greater economic growth. So, some of the bilateral unilateral decisions, that was to liberalize the economy, other bilateral decisions when we were collaborating with one country, and then the multilateral forum like the WTO, it resulted in very good economic condition for India, and we were happy. Now in recent years, though India has signed free trade agreements with Singapore, with Mercosur as a group, Sri Lanka and SAFTA, Mauritius, their combined share in India's total export is only 10 to 11%. So you see, the idea is that free trade agreements are not big deals. So it is multilateralism that we have to work towards. In other words, almost 90% of India's export is being realized through the multilateral channel. So something which is giving an output of 90% has to be focused more upon. So this was the time when we realized that we have to make more efforts towards multilateralism rather than bilateral or preferential or free trade agreements. Now thereby, if you look at all the above points that I have stated, the given existing trend in India's trade is that the multilateral option is best suited for the Indian economy. So this is the gist or the outcome of the argument, that multilateralism has to be the best option, and it is the best option because of the growth rate that India has seen. Now quoting two of the political scientists, Mattu and Subramanian, in 1999, they have strongly argued in favor of India engaging itself more actively in the multilateral trading system. Now Mattu and Subramaniam have given at least four convincing reasons to substantiate their argument for multilateral engagement. First reason that they give is to facilitate domestic reform and enhance access for India's exports. So this is the why we should have multilateral engagements. Second is it to serve as a common commitment to good policies. So every good policy should have a common commitment, and what best than multilateral could provide this kind of good policies. To serve as a means for securing market access rights that have already been established. This again, there are established markets. It is only through multilateralism that we are able to access the various markets. So the market proliferation is possible only if we have multilateralism, and also to serve as a bulwark against regionalism, because the regional forces or the regional arrangements become very emphatic and they become very deeply entrenched, and if you have to contest against or to suppress these kind of regional ideas, then nothing better than multilateralism is an option. Now if we talk about multilateralism, I have talked about emphasize on economics, and I would like to emphasize on environmental aspects also, because environment is one aspect which is being only deliberated on multiple fora, because environment is an aspect which does not affect a single country or its neighboring countries, it affects the entire universe. So for an issue which is global, we need groups or forums to discuss which are also global in outlook, and then we have the option of only multilateral agencies. Now factors which gave importance to environmental aspects. Why is environmental concern on the rise? First is the social and economic transformation, basically globalization. Globalization had a fallout on environment, and that is why people started talking about environment being dictated by the West or the dominant South. Then there were emergence of democratic government. These democratic governments, they were concerned about environment, and because they were elected by the people, they could raise their voice. They could say that yes, environment is one thing which needs to be protected. Then there was large scale degradation and depletion of natural resources. So the natural resources, especially the non-renewable ones, were getting diminished, they were getting depleted, and they couldn't be renewed. So we had to bring in some matter of concern, some issue of concern. Then there was the widening economic gap between the north and the south, and this north-south divide becomes very important when we are negotiating in terms of environment, because environment has an economic cost. If you want to save the environment, there has to be a compromise on the economic development, and this is when the countries decide not to have environment as their agenda, because economics for some countries is more important. The option of sustainable development. What is sustainable development? How can we have a compromise between environment and development? These are some of the questions which were plaguing every discussion on multilateral fora. Now, role of domestic and international actors in environmental policy making and advocacy network was also becoming very important. So, it was not only the national governments which were talking, all the national governments were coming together and they were raising the same kind of concerns. So, it became a very, very widespread issue, and that is where this concept called environmentalism or the ideology of environment begins rising. Now, what are the contested issues related to environment in multilateral fora? Whenever we have a discussion, then some of the countries get divided, and what are the aspects on which the countries get divided? The first is called the degree of carbon emission, how much to emit. Okay, if I am not able to cut down my emission, I have the option of buying my emission capacity, that is, there are carbon credits available in the market, and if I have exceeded my limit, I have to pay. If I want to emit more than that, then I can go and buy carbon credit from the market. So, as a result, the total amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not coming down. The only thing is that is emerging is that it is becoming a market, environment is becoming a market. Then the second problem is the north-south divide. So, the north, as I told you, were the countries of the developed world, and south were the developing countries, and there was a major divide in the north and the south about who would take responsibility, who would pay for the cleanup. As a leader of South, India opposes the blame being put on South for the degradation. So, at multilateral forum, India has this stand that it is not the South which has degraded the environment, rather it is the North, and they have done it far back, and now when we are trying to develop, they are trying to obstruct us. So, India has been taking this stand. Now, India has also tried to form a cartel to critically analyze the terms and conditions of the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol is one which brands countries as emitters of carbon dioxide, and it gives them a time frame within which you have to cut down your emission. Now, the catch of the situation is, supposing a country is emitting 0.5 grams of carbon dioxide. Now, and supposing this is a developed country, there is another country which is only manufacturing 0.05 grams of carbon dioxide. I am just taking a hypothetical situation. Now, if we are asked to cut by 50%, the country which is emitting 0.5 will come down to 0.25, and the country which is emitting only 0.05 has to come down to 0.025. So, it is still the country which was emitting more is still 10 times, is allowed to emit 10 times more than the permissible limit. So, this is why India is not agreeing to the carbon cut, the emission cut they have prescribed, this Kyoto Protocol. Another problem is dumping of toxic wastes. Toxic wastes which do not find or which are very difficult to dispose because of the strict environmental legislations in the west, they are being sent and dumped in the developing countries. For example, the shipwrecking industry in Alang, Gujarat. So, all these ships which have nuclear warheads or which have some nuclear elements, they are brought into Alang in Gujarat, and there they are wrecked. So, the nuclear radioactivity which is still there is indirectly transported to India. Then the other problem area is transfer of technology, because we are not transferring technology, we are transferring obsolete technology, technology that would have more environmental impacts, negative impacts on the environment. So, we are, in the name of technology, we are transferring only obsolete technology. Now, while setting environmental norms, we are just having one umbrella legislation or one umbrella policy, but when India contests that whenever there is an environmental legislation which is being formed, we must take into consideration the poverty and the population of the third world or the developing countries. These have to be taken into consideration. And the fourth problem, the next problem is that India, the disappearance of indigenous identity, that is the local tribal cultures, because of the coming in of the outside forces, these get diluted and lost. So, one important aspect of environmentalism is to keep the indigenous identity intact. Now, what are the future challenges in terms of environment? How environmentalism will still be a problem whenever we are having a multilateral forum? Environment will be a problem, and what are the challenges of environmental politics? First problem is that environmental politics in South is only in its infancy, it is in a very nascent stage. Then what is the likely role of environmental issues in free trade agreements? Are we only negotiating on economic issues? Are we bringing in the environmental and ethical concerns into these issues or discussions? Now, debate on the historic responsibility of the countries of the North for emission and requiring compensation from them is still going to be problematic. That is, the responsibility, fixing of responsibility as to who is the polluter, and if the polluter has been identified, the polluter must pay. So, this polluter pay principle will still remain to be problematic because identification is very difficult. And the other challenge would remain, that is vulnerability of the developing countries. If out of all the discussions on environment, the developing countries are more vulnerable, because if they are asked to change the technology or be more environment compliant, it is the development or production which is going to be affected, and these are vulnerable economies, they cannot afford to do that. So, these are some of the problems. Now, talking about multipolarity, India began its quest for multipolar world because it was fearing that China is dominating Asia, and so it talks about multipolarity. And India's strategy of engagement with all other powers after the Cold War was that there should be multiple poles, we do not want a unipolar or a bipolar world. And the compulsion for looking beyond and India in the meantime had given non-alignment, but it had to go beyond non-alignment, and for this it starts looking beyond non-alignment, and it says that China's rise is a threat and therefore we must have a multipolar world. Now, these are some of the problems that will emerge whenever we are talking about multipoles, and then I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that one of the challenges at the systemic level is the distribution of power. Although India's own emergence as a global power contributes to reordering of the international hierarchy, the faster and more dramatic rise of China, the relative decline of European powers and Japan, and growing doubts about the United States' ability to sustain its primacy after the global financial crisis are generating an international environment that will test many of the premises that we have talked about. And India's foreign and national security policy, its ideas on multilateralism will have to be reinvented. Thank you.